When you have a look at how Fremantle have finished off the year, look, they haven't been tested with really strong opposition. Now, the one thing that I would qualify Fremantle, we're all very upbeat about Freo, and rightfully so, based on that very good win at Simmons Stadium. But over the month or 2 months leading into the finals, gee, they had a soft run, didn't they? If you have a look at how they finished off the year, they really were able to form their team against some poor opposition. Round 15 against St Kilda, round 16 West Coast, who was shot. Round 17 they came and lost comfortably to the Tigers, and then they pantsed Adelaide, Carlton, GWS, Melbourne, Port Adelaide at home, with Port Adelaide already secure in the 8, and of course that loss against St Kilda that didn't mean a jot.
But doesn't that make it even more meritorious what they did at Simmons Stadium?
I agree. I'm saying they were able to come to Simmons Stadium, and Geelong jumped them. I mean, Geelong are a wonderful team playing on their own dung heap, and they jumped them. Now, any thought that Fremantle might be overawed by the situation, well, they certainly weren't then. They didn't panic. They worked their way back in by half-time. And as we saw in the last 10 minutes of the game before Hill kicked that fantastic sealing goal, they were very comfortable with a 10-point lead, which is almost insurmountable when you're playing Fremantle, and they've got their very tough defensive game face on. They used Sandilands very well in the last 15 minutes. I just think that we've seen in the last few months that they can score. They're not by any means impotent when it comes time to scoring, and probably the first time we got an inkling of that was against the Swans when they trailed by 26, no goods, I mean, they were really down and out that day. They had obviously no goods. Fremantle were up against a Sydney that had a goods, but also Fremantle had no Pavlich, no Sandilands. Walters went off during that game. They turned to Michael Johnson to be the tap, and they turned him on. He almost won them the game.
Well, he should have with a shot from 50 metres that didn't make the distance as well, didn't get punched through. You're right. So this is a side that does extraordinary things. Last year, they beat Geelong in a elimination final. That's enough for them. That's great. Well done. We won a final against the odds. This year, I don't think anyone feels they're just a little bit complacent. And you look at their strength, look at their key defenders. You know, all of a sudden Johnson comes in with McFarlane and Dawson. Look at their rucks. Yes, we know that Mummy and Co are exceptional with Pike as well. But Zach Clark and Sandler has got to be the best ruck combination in the league. Pavlich and Mayne, star players who are in good form. Look at the small forwards. Ballantyne antagonises. Fife, if he plays on a half-forward, kicks goals. Walters is outstanding as well. I just don't see a weakness for a side that is so well coached. They're not going to give McVeigh 41 possessions. They're not going to give Hanbury 3 goals in the first half again. Rossi would have scrutinised those tapes to the nth degree and looked at a battle plan that would shut down the prime movers and shut down Sydney as a whole. Pavlich
has come back in good form. I think he was great against Geelong. Didn't get a lot of the plaudits, but certainly when he led, he honoured most of the kicks that came to him, and if he wasn't able to mark them, he certainly made the contest that brought in the likes. And Walters wasn't particularly effective. You know, they didn't get enormous service out of their small forwards, but what they did get was 2 good targets in Mayne and Pavlich that will have to be very much locked down upon by Richards and Grundy.
And Pavlich missed those early shots, and then he took it upon himself to go the U-turn, hook the ball over his right shoulder, beautiful snap, and from there, as you say, this is a side that had been jumped, and they got such momentum from that Pavlich goal, and they just rolled into the game, and then they rolled over Geelong in the second half.
So even though they didn't have, remember, this was at the SCG, even though Goods played that game and was close to Sydney's best from memory, he played a really good game.
Yeah.
Even though there was no Pavlich, there was no Sandilands, and for most of the game, no Walters, 3 very important players. It was a draw. Do you know what else was an interesting feature of that game? Freo had 10 more scoring shots.
They really?
It was 11-4 to 9-16. So it looks as though on current form they can handle the Swans the week off. Are we concerned at all that some of their players have only played once? Effectively, by the time this game is played, will have only played once in a month?
Potentially, yeah. Rossi Lyon said he's been really aware of the St Kilda preliminary finals, and I think in one of those games when they had a week's rest, they did almost nothing. They came out and struggled in the prelim. The next week, they got some more fitness into them. So he will have trained them to within an inch of their lives. He will have given them a really intense session last Saturday. Are we worried about that? Yeah, a little bit. But I think with Rossi that those players just buy in so much that, yes, if they have a quiet first half, they find the intensity and they find the things that Rossi wants to get out of them, and that's why I don't think it's a huge factor.
So, give me your summary of the game. I'll give you a couple of minutes to go through what you think might happen.
So how did Sydney turn it around last week? That they were battling at times, and then they got off the chain. The midfielders went to work. They got players like Hanbury, who got repeat efforts, the little handball into space. They got McVeigh, who just kept on dropping off the pack, would take a half forward into the pack, and then he just drops off, and then he gets the possessions as well. That was outstanding, but Carlton let them do that. So for me, Fremantle's real ability is to, in that pack with 4 or 5 players milling about, they get goal side, but they get the other side as well. They just do not let that ball come out easily. And that's how Sydney dominated Carlton. So as much as players like Fife and Mundy and Barlow and Hill are amazing players, they also have midfield accountability. And so I think Fremantle is going to pump that ball in through midfield dominance and through ruck dominance, and they're going to set the wall up, and they're not going to allow the slingshot. They're not going to allow the Hanbury to get free and run all the way into space as he has done, on Patterson Stadium before. I think they're an outstanding side. I love what Rossi Lyon does. I don't even worry for 1 second that they're complacent and that they feel like it's going to be easy against Sydney. He'll have them wound up. He has tactical nous. Is John Longmore a great coach as well? Yes, but I just think at Patterson Stadium with the week off, with Johnson back into that side, with the blend of pace from players like Hill and extraction from players like Mundy, I just see that that they beat Sydney. They wind down, they override, and they run a Sydney side, a tired Sydney side, off their feet by the end.
Stats that matter. Since round 16, Fremantle has scored from 56% of its inside 50s, ranked number 1 in the competition. The Dockers have only conceded 48 inside 50s per match against the top 7 or the finalists this season. Puts them second from a defensive point of view, so they do very well against the good teams. The Dockers have allowed their opposition to win 39% of the centre bounces this season, second defensively. So their ruck stocks have held up. We know that, of course, Griffin was a very good player, got injured, but through the combination of Griffin, Clark, and now with Sandland's back means that they just don't lose hitouts. Nat Fyfe has taken 20 contested marks this season, the most of any midfielder in the comp, so he's a great contested mark.
And a lot of those as well when you think about the defensive wall. How many times can you remember Nat Fyfe when the ball's kicked out long and he just jumps third up in the pack as well? So, yeah, he takes contested marks and sometimes they're forward of centre, but he takes them the way Fremantle wants him to, protecting the space, protecting the ball from being slingshot from one end to the other.
Here's a concerning one for Swans supporters. The Swans have generated a score from 41% of their inside 50s against the finalists this season, ranked 18th in the competition. Whew. That's not a great one, but they've only allowed their opposition to record a kicking efficiency of 62% this season, ranked number 1 defensively. So hustle, hustle, hustle around the ground, and they've kept their opposition's kicking efficiency down.
I think both Richards and Grundy have just been serviceable this year. But certainly Richards in the last 6 weeks has been great, and I thought Grundy was excellent last week. So they're players that all of a sudden, when the whips are cracking, have started to lift as well. And it's important, as I said, for Rampy to try and get third in, but that's going to be tough when he's got a Ballantyne or someone of that ilk.
Here's how I read the game, and of course we know that Fremantle have really controlled so much of their not only possession but also just the game, just the scoreboard. May only be a 3 or 4 goal lead, but they really do dominate and tempo the game away from their opposition when they can get to an early lead. So, of course, the early part of this game remains very important, and to that end, boy oh boy, there's going to be a heck of a lot on the shoulders of Mumford and Pike to try and get their palm on the ball, get the ball working forward, because the one place Sydney will not be in any way deficient is their midfield. We know how good McVeigh was last week. Whether he starts off a half-back flank is irrelevant. He'll run through the midfield. Kieran Jack, they started really well in the middle last week. Kieran Jack, obviously, Kennedy hasn't had a brilliant year, but I thought he was better last week, so he could have his better football ahead of him.
Surprised he was in the top 40 All-Australian. I think that was a peculiar decision.
obviously Sydney need to somehow get a foothold in the game early. That being said, I just believe that Fremantle have become beautifully drilled. We all know what we think of Ross Lyon, or most of us think of Ross Lyon, and that is that they've got this really well-drilled team that can both come back, hold on to a lead, or if need be, put a team to the sword. McFarlane still remains speculative, and I'll be interested to see how he holds up, but when you've got McFarlane down back, or Zach Dawson, there's not a lot of tall offensive threat from Sydney. That being said, of course, that may be their best opportunity with Pike and Mumford drifting forward. I imagine Dawson, do you agree? Will Dawson take Jesse White?
I think that makes a lot of sense, yep.
So the offensive threat will obviously come from the other ruckman, and we'll see whether or not Zach Clark plays back or Michael Johnson, who they like to separate and be a loose man, goes third man up. But I think they've got the main dangers there covered. And in the end, it's going to be too much up front for Fremantle. That is, yes, Pavlich and Mayne have got good opponents in Grundy and Richards, but is there really the depth to cover Ballantyne and Walters? Yep. I'm not certain of that. And then the unknowns, players like Lee Spur, and we've already mentioned Neil, they tend to bob up. Even Subin kicking goals. Outside run from Hill and from Daniel Pearce. I think they've got enough to cover the Swans. For mine, Fremantle by 19.
How does Sydney win, and how have they won in the past? Goods, a blinder. Well, he's not playing. Someone like Jetta, a blinder. Well, he's really struggling as well. Could Tippett kick goals? Well, he's not playing as well. Could you get someone like McVeigh to have 41 possessions to kick 2 goals? There's no way they allow him to do that. So I agree. A lot of their strengths have been taken away or will be taken away by Fremantle. I've got Fremantle by 36 points.
Well, both of us agree there.